Okay, I'm going to start. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Chicago Justice Show. So we are going to be talking with Lauren Cole. She's back again. This time, the report is on John Catanzara, from president of the Chicago Police Board, and he's been a Chicago police officer for 23 years. The title of our latest report is Catanzara, 23 Years of Misconduct, Complaints, and Social Media Controversies. Lauren, thanks so much for jumping back on with us.
Thank you for having me.
So for those who don't know Mr. Catanzara, he is a lightning rod for, he's great at leveling criticism at everyone and everything, but does not accept it about himself for sure. And he, for some reason, is also a lightning rod in getting complaints, both from, residents of Chicago and fellow officers. To startling amounts. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the method you used for this report before we get into any of the things you found in some of his social media posts?
Sure. So Catanzara has been in a lot of very public controversies in his time, violating CPD protocol openly on his social media. So we wanted to document that as many times as we could. But what's gotten lost in a lot of media coverage of just his social media is the huge amount of misconduct complaints that he has amassed in his 23 years of working as an officer for the CPD. So we used the Invisible Institute's data set with records of misconduct complaints against CPD officers. It goes back to, I think, the 1980s, so late 1980s, which is important because the city has fought to keep a lot of these records out of the public eye. So it's important that we can use them. Anyway, we went through all of these misconduct complaints against Catanzara and sorted them by what their recommended finding was supposed to be, if the decision was supposed to be sustained, not sustained, unfounded, exonerated, or unknown, because there was a blank in the data set, by either COPA or the Bureau of Internal Affairs. And then we also looked at what the final decision by the police board was: to discipline, not to discipline, find it sustained, not sustained, etc.
Okay, can you give our audience, so there's basically 4 different official responses to when someone files a complaint. And since somewhere in the mid-2000s, you have to file a complaint and then sign an affidavit. But let's say all of that happens and there is an investigation. What are the 4 possible outcomes?
So there is sustained, which means the allegation is supported by sufficient evidence to justify discipline. Not sustained, which means there is insufficient evidence to either prove or disprove the allegation. Unfounded, which means the allegation is completely false or not factual. And exonerated, which means the incident occurred, but the actions of the accused were lawful and proper. And then we have a last category, unknown, because there was a lack of available information on the outcome, because there was no affidavit, or COPA, BIA, or the police board have not yet made a decision because the complaint is recent.
Right. So let me just underscore one part of that. When people think, when you go into a criminal trial and you go into it, right, you get a jury trial or whatever, and you're found not guilty, that isn't necessarily the same finding as innocent. It just means the prosecution did not reach its burden of proof requirements for the jury or the judge to find you guilty. So those are 2 different things. This is also with this finding of not sustained. It's very similar as being a not guilty, and rather than it's not equal as that, it does not mean you're innocent of the offense, right? Unfounded means you're completely innocent. Not sustained means they just didn't gather enough evidence to meet their burden of proof, but they do think there is evidence to prove that it happened, right? That the allegation is somewhat reliable. So I don't want people to see, when they see through the data visualizations with the report, they see not sustained as being innocent. It really isn't that. So let's go on to how many complaints does Mr. Catanzara have? How many were sustained? Who are these complaints from? Just give us a little bit of that history.
Another limitation of the data set is that many citizens don't know that these processes to file misconduct complaints exist. So it's possible that there are like more instances of misconduct that we just don't know about because there was never a complaint filed. But on to the numbers, we found 50 total complaints specifically directed at Catanzara over his 23-year career so far, which averages about 2 complaints per year. The most complaints he received in a single year is 7, and the least amount of complaints he has received in a year is 0, which only happened in 6 years in his 23-year span, which is absolutely not acceptable for any officer and definitely not the head of the police union.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. It's amazing to me that he survived 50 complaints. 50 people, both internal to the department and external to the department, a mixture, filed complaints against someone and that person kept their job. That number is amazing. So do we have a breakdown? Do we know how many were internal versus like filed by fellow officers or supervisors versus external filed by citizens or residents of Chicago?
We do not in this because with the data from the Invisible Institute, it looked like some were not didn't have enough documentation to verify who the complaint was filed by. So it was marked false for or unknown for being filed by an officer. But in many cases, those could have been filed by officers. Like his most common complaint against him is operational/personal violations, and those are mostly internal. But some of those were marked in the data set as not filed by officers or couldn't be confirmed to be filed by officers. So we couldn't do that comparison. Although with more FOIA requests, we hope to get something out like that in the future.
Yeah, we good point. We are filing more because most of the documents related to his misconduct cases were actually warehoused by the Office of Professional Standards. And when the Office of Professional Standards was changed and moved and created into a separate agency called the Independent Police Review Authority, IPRA, the acronym IPRA, did not take the Office of Professional Standards or records. Those stayed with the department. So you can't FOIA them through FOIAing what is now COPA, which took the place of IPRA. We're acronym heavy on this talk today. Citizen Office of Police Accountability, COPA, doesn't have IPRA's. They have IPRA's records, but IPRA never got the OPS records. So we have to get those, unfortunately, from Internal Affairs. And it'll be somewhere long from now before those records get made public. I'm sure the police department's going to fight like crazy to keep those all secret. I have heard some stories that I cannot repeat because I cannot confirm them of Catanzara's history with some of his fellow officers, and it is not good. Okay, so we have a couple of visualizations on the website about, so how many of those 50 complaints were actually sustained against Mr. Catanzara?
So 10 out of 50 were sustained, even though 12 were recommended by COPA or the or BIA to be sustained, which meant that the police board decided to rule against what the recommendation was in the final finding.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, it's important to understand they tried to fire John Catanzara twice in the same year. In the year after he had his 7 complaints, they tried to fire him twice in 2008. And in both instances, the police board reduced, they didn't find him innocent. They were just reduced the discipline from termination to a 20-day suspension for each.
Yeah, it's important to touch on that trend because it happened another time too. Of the 10 sustained complaints, he was only even disciplined for 9, which means that the police board found him guilty of one of these complaints and decided flat out not to discipline him, in addition to lowering the recommended terminations twice to just 20-day suspensions.
It's really unbelievable. And you're saying to yourself, I know for people watching this, like if you're pro police accountability or you're pro the police department, Catanzara's existence on the department undermines every claim you could possibly have that the system works. Ladies and gentlemen, listen to this. Think about any job you have ever had, including the one you're currently in, and think about your likelihood of keeping it if 50 people filed complaints against you. And those complaints being a mixture from clients that you are serving to fellow coworkers and your bosses. Could you possibly keep that job? I know. I even worked for my brother-in-law one time, and there's no way I would have survived in that business with 50 complaints. Um, I think once we got up into like the mid crooked numbers, 6, 7, 8, I'd have probably been history. One other thing that I want to touch on before we get into his social media history, which is pretty grotesque. And we're just going to touch on it lightly because too many of them are too vulgar and ridiculous and horrific to read. But, ladies and gentlemen, Catanzara is the worst or biggest hypocrite there is, maybe in Chicago at the moment. He is in a job where his job is to enforce rules and regulations. He is supposed to be oversight on the residents of Chicago and everyone who travels to or through Chicago for any reason, work, entertainment, whatever. He is an overseer to make sure you are following the laws, right? That the lawmakers write. That's his job. And in doing that, he racked up 50 complaints for misconduct from the people he serves and his supervisors, his coworkers and supervisors. And we'll get into some of the social media about his bosses and work coworkers. He couldn't care less about his supervisors. He thinks they're all horrible. He thinks they're all useless. He thinks the rules are ridiculous and awful. Think about that great hypocrisy. He has spent over 2 decades holding people accountable to a set of rules. But he operates in a system like we all do at work that has certain rules. And he can't possibly show his disdain for those rules more in his behavior, right? Because he breaks the rules constantly and does not care about it, and shows just utter disdain for through all of his social media posts. And we're not going to go over them. We've got them through the Invisible Institute. We've got, and using media outlets, Lauren put together a list of them it's just mind-blowingly gross. There's really not a group of, there's not a minority group in the city or anywhere in America that Catanzara has not picked on or degraded or showed hatred for. So without going, I'm not going to make you read them all. You can see them all on our website. I'm even I want people to be able to see them and know the real truth, but I'm also kind of disgusted with having to publish them. Did you find any of these particularly, especially the ones about his bosses or his coworkers particularly, did one particularly stand out among all the disgustingness?
Oh, well, I mean, there are plenty of more tame posts in his collection, content wise, that are still just very obviously breaking rules of how the CPD is supposed to function, right? Their code of conduct. He's made political statements in uniform. He's called CPD officers and his superiors spineless and sad. He's made many racist, xenophobic, sexist, transphobic, you name it, otherwise offensive statements on here. He even, in response to his current investigation, he said that in so many words, even if I'm fired, I'm going to try to hold on to this job, which is constitutionally questionable when it comes to the FOP. So there's just very little regard for the rules and the structures in place that he is in charge of.
So we're going to be, when the video plays for this, ladies and gentlemen, you'll be seeing, and I'm sure you're seeing right now, I'm going to show some of them, the milder ones. But it's true. To give you a little insight, Catanzara has a worldview, such as it is, and everyone and anyone that disagrees, and no matter what rules or laws there are that disagree with him that he is supposed to follow, he will not follow any of them. Whether it's sexual assault victims or victims of violence or Black Lives Matter or people of the Muslim faith. If you're a woman, he seems to have a particular, would you agree that he seems to have a particular habit of posting really misogynistic posts?
I completely agree with that. If there's a pattern here, it's misogyny, and it's also being very into policing particular neighborhoods and defending those police tactics.
Yes. It's interesting to me that if you follow his logic about they're the only thing, the police are the only thing standing between anarchy and the city, one could argue then if you just look at policing without looking at any of the science about what actually stops and prevents violence and crime from happening, well, New York went from 2,000 murders to 400. Chicago went from 900 at best 450 or 425 one year. So that means New York is, since it went down 75% or almost 80% reduction in homicides, that New York police are better than Chicago, right? If there's no other factors and it's only due to policing. I've always wondered, like I always wanted to ask these people, him being him a representative of the very pro-policing, let us do whatever we deem necessary to take the streets back, why we shouldn't just fire all the Chicago police officers and hire the New York ones, right? Because if they got an 80% drop in homicides and Chicago got like close to what, 55, 60%, 80% is better than 60%. We should bring in New York's cops. Yeah, from Chelsea Clinton. God, I'm not even going to read them. I'm just going to leave them. What was the, being not so knee deep in all the criminal justice issues every day, like I am here and we are at CJP, what did you find the most surprising and then the most disturbing from having to dive into the Catanzara 23-year history of complaints and everything he's done?
I think I'm sort of desensitized to this stuff at this point after having so many Trump tweets for 4 years, that this is sort of what I expect from people who hold any sort of position of authority in the US now, which is to the right, which is quite sad to say. Um, but if anything, he really defends a lot of, like, if he does something bad and he violates rules and he says something horrible about his superior in a public place, online or something like that, and then receives criticism for it or receives discipline for it, he just digs his heels in and says, no, I didn't do anything wrong. And he'll post about that as well. So obviously he's not learning from any of his mistakes. He is just making more. He's just piling on the list. So yeah, that is obviously very disturbing for someone who's the basically the head of a police department, the head of a police union.
Yeah, I think there's two things that stand out to me besides the misogyny. Um, and it's just, I would say there's two real things. The misogyny is one of them. And the other is just, I kind of think self-defeating. Why? Like, because one of the complaints, ladies and gentlemen, that I think he's on more or less trial in front of the Chicago Police Board for now, they're seeking his termination again. One of those, I think, is stemming from him complaining about a march on the Dan Ryan Expressway that was basically sanctioned by Rahm Emanuel. And basically, Rahm Emanuel, through Father Flager, was told, hey, we want a big march. We want a substantive march. We want to make a statement, but we're willing to work with the city when this happens, when and where this will occur. So it was decided that they were going to do it on the Dan Ryan Expressway, but the organizers had decided to do it on a Saturday. And they decided to give the city notice. And I think they only went one or two exits down. So it was a very short-term thing. Catanzara went ballistic with it. And he filed, I think at some point, filed the police report against the superintendent, Eddie Johnson, right? And then that got deleted, and there's a whole saga with it. It will come out in the hearing. We're going to be posting transcripts to his hearings. Maybe that's a research project, people reading the transcripts to his hearings and trying to find out why he was found not guilty the last times. But it just seems really self-defeating. Like, I don't know what he was hoping to do there other than to vent his anger at them, at the city allowing protesters on the Dan Ryan.
Yeah, and this was also an event that was greenlit by at the time, director of Illinois State Police, Leo Schmitz, and he just went for him very hard in his social media posts and his Facebook posts, and also for Eddie Johnson multiple times.
Yeah, Leo Schmitz, you probably don't know this, but Leo Schmitz was a former CPD officer and commander. So they either had a run-in, or he just doesn't like anyone in any sign of leadership, and he seems to strike out. I mean, this is not a person that likes having people disagree with him. There's no doubt about that. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, please go read it. Lauren did an amazing job writing it. You can go look at the social media posts for yourself or spin by them, which I often do because I can't take reading them over and over again. I feel bad for Lauren having to dive into the Catanzara era here. We are going to be filing new FOIAs for his records with internal affairs, and I think I'm going to go dig up the police board transcripts. I think that would make an interesting piece to look at how he got off in those cases and whether or not that was right. And he's on trial now, fighting for his job. And as Lauren mentioned, he says in his social media post that he can stay in power at the FOP, the Fraternal Order of Police. And it seems to be somewhat dubious a little bit, because as far as I know from sources, I haven't read them, the bylaws and everything, you have to be a sworn officer to be the president. I'm not sure if that's true. I mean, it turns out you don't need to be a member of the House of Representatives in the United States of America to actually be the Speaker of the House. They can nominate any human being they want, which is why there's a movement pushing for Trump to be the Speaker. Who knows what is true there. Catanzara definitely is the person who, if he got fired and could keep the union position job, he would keep it. He is not going away quietly. All right, Lauren, thank you so much. I really appreciate you jumping on with us.
Real quick on that note about him trying to hold on to power, he posted himself a screenshot of the requirements for nomination for the role of president of the police board, and it says you have to be in continuous
president of the FOP.
Sorry, FOP. Yeah, not police board. He posted a screenshot for the nomination and qualifications for officers who are nominated to be the head of the FOP, and it said you have to be in continuous good standing for 2 years as an active member in the CPD, which, you know, if you've been suspended for a little over half a year under investigation, it's questionable about whether that would allow you to qualify for nomination or meet membership requirements for being in the FOP anyway. But that is not something I'm an expert on, and is a battle I'm sure will play out in the coming weeks.
Right, and it'll be interesting. It only is going to be a battle if someone from the FOP protests his position, right? But it would mean, at least in the general reading I am having right now through you, because you just read it, is that he wouldn't be able to be nominated for re-election in a couple of years, because by that time he would not be in good standing for 2 years prior to that. So that may be a way to get rid of John Catanzara. Okay, thanks again, Lauren. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.